The cold wind of Mongolia lashes the flags bearing the blue wolf emblem. We stand on the shores of Lake Bur. In the year 1388, a Mongol army of 50,000 warriors prepares for what will be, without them knowing, the last great battle of their empire. Men who carry in their veins the blood of the most feared conquerors in history, direct descendants of those who once ruled from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. In front of them, on the horizon, the red banners of the Ming dynasty are already visible. These are not the submissive Chinese their ancestors easily subdued a century earlier. This time they are 80,000 disciplined soldiers, armed with the best technology, led by brilliant generals with a clear objective to exterminate the last vestige of Mongol power. How did the heirs of Genghis Khan arrive here? How is it possible that the largest empire the world had ever known is now cornered, fighting not to expand, but to survive? This is not a tale of glorious rise. It is the chronicle of a spectacular fall. The story of how the greatest land empire of all time fragmented, weakened, and was finally brought to its knees. Welcome to the Battle of Lake Bur, the moment when the legacy of Genghis Khan was broken forever. If you have ever wondered how empires that seemed eternal fall, or how the conquered eventually become conquerors, this account will answer your questions. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and join me to witness the final act of the Mongol saga, the day the steppe wolves stopped howling. What you are about to witness is more than a simple battle. It is the end of an era. It is the twilight of an empire that changed the world forever, but could not change its own destiny. Are you ready to discover how the heirs of the great Khan fell? Keep watching. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Lake Bur in 1388, we must travel more than 150 years back, when a tribal leader unified the Mongol clans and changed the course of world history. Temujin, the man the world would know as Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 in the harsh Mongolian steppes. His childhood was marked by tragedy. His father was poisoned when he was only 9 years old, and his family was abandoned by their clan, condemned to survive in extreme poverty. Hunting rats and gathering roots, the young Temujin learned lessons no prince in a palace could have learned: hardness, perseverance, and relentless determination. What forges the character of a conqueror? Privilege and wealth, or adversity and struggle? The story of Genghis Khan gives us a clear answer. By 1206, after decades of wars and strategic alliances, Temujin achieved the impossible, unifying all Mongol tribes under his command. The steppes that for millennia had been home to scattered and warring clans became the foundation of a nascent empire. In a great Kurultai assembly, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What followed was the most successful and devastating military campaign the world had seen. In less than 3 decades, the Mongols conquered a territory stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. Ancient cities like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Kiev were reduced to ashes. Ancient empires that had resisted for centuries fell in months. The world population decreased by approximately 40 million people due to these conquests. Why were the Mongols so successful? The answer lies in 3 key factors: mobility, discipline, and innovation. Unlike the sedentary armies of the time, each Mongol warrior had several horses, allowing them to cover up to 160 kilometers daily. An unthinkable feat for any army of the era. Their military organization, based on the decimal system, allowed perfect coordination between units, and their ability to adopt foreign technologies, from Chinese engineers for sieges to Persian administrators to govern conquered territories, gave them critical advantages over their enemies. For the Chinese, the Mongol conquest meant an unprecedented humiliation. The sophisticated civilization that had invented gunpowder, the compass, and printing fell to what they considered uncultured barbarians. In 1271, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, completed the conquest of China and established the Yuan dynasty. For the first time in its millennial history, China was ruled by foreigners. For nearly a century, the Mongols dominated China with an iron hand. Ethnic Chinese were classified in the lowest category of society, even below non-Mongol foreigners. They were forbidden to learn Mongolian, bear arms, or access government positions. This systematic humiliation planted the seeds of resentment that would germinate in the Ming Rebellion. But even at its peak, the Mongol Empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. Unlike other civilizations, the Mongols never completely abandoned their nomadic tradition of dividing territory among the ruler's sons. After the death of Genghis Khan, the empire fragmented into four khanates: the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. At first, these khanates maintained a fraternal alliance. But as generations passed, family ties weakened, and each khanate began to follow its own path, sometimes even clashing with one another. The unity that had made the Mongols invincible began to crack. Meanwhile, in China, the Yuan dynasty faced its own problems. Kublai had tried to balance ruling as a Chinese emperor while preserving Mongol identity. His successors, however, lacked his vision and political skill. Many of them, raised in luxurious palaces, lost the hardness and pragmatism that characterized their steppe ancestors. Administration became corrupt and inefficient. Taxes increased to finance failed military campaigns against Japan and Vietnam. Disastrous monetary policies led to runaway inflation. And to make matters worse, nature seemed to turn against the Yuan. Catastrophic floods of the Yellow River in the 1340s were followed by outbreaks of bubonic plague that decimated the population. Can an empire survive when it loses the respect of its subjects and the loyalty of its elites? The history of the Yuan teaches us that it cannot. In this context of crisis emerged the figure who would change China's destiny, Zhu Yuanzhang, an orphan peasant who had found refuge in a Buddhist monastery. When famine destroyed his monastery, Zhu joined a millenarian-oriented rebellion known as the Red Turbans. Endowed with natural military talent and sharp political intelligence, Zhu rose quickly in the rebel ranks. Unlike other rebel leaders who focused on religious mysticism, he understood that defeating the Mongols would require more than fervor. It would require organization, discipline, and a clear vision for China after the Yuan. By 1355, Zhu had established his base in Nanjing and begun building a shadow state with civil administration, tax collection, and a professional army. While other rebel leaders fought among themselves, he consolidated his territory and refined his army. You may wonder, how could a simple peasant challenge the Mongol power that had subdued entire kingdoms and empires? The answer reveals a fundamental truth about power, no matter how strong a regime is. When it loses legitimacy, it becomes vulnerable even to the humblest adversary. And so, as we watch the armies prepare for battle at Lake Bure, we must remember that what we are seeing is not just the clash of two military forces. It is the collision of two worldviews, that of a nomadic empire that conquered through mobility and force, and that of an agricultural civilization that survived through adaptation and patience. What do you think happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object? Keep watching to find out. The year 1368 marked a before and after in Asian history. After decades of rebellion, Zhu Yuanzhang achieved what seemed impossible, completely expelling the Mongols from China. That same year, he proclaimed himself Emperor Hongwu, great military achievement, and founded the Ming dynasty. Zhu's victory was not the product of chance or luck. It was the result of a combination of strategic factors that he knew how to exploit better than any other rebel leader. First, he understood that to defeat the Mongols, he would need more than courage. He would need to overcome their own tactics. For years, he meticulously studied his enemies. He learned that despite their ferocity in open field, the Mongols had significant vulnerabilities. Their supply lines were long and vulnerable. Their nomadic lifestyle made prolonged sieges difficult. And crucially, they had become dependent on Chinese administrators to govern the country. Second, Zhu revolutionized the rebel army. Instead of the poorly organized bands that characterize other rebellions, he created disciplined units with regular training. He implemented a military household system where entire families were dedicated to military service, ensuring a constant supply of loyal recruits. And most importantly, he developed a heavy infantry corps capable of withstanding Mongol cavalry charges. Third, Zhu understood that military victory had to be accompanied by a political vision. Unlike other rebel leaders who promised religious utopias, he offered something concrete: the restoration of Confucian order, the expulsion of foreign barbarians, and the return to a government based on meritocracy through imperial examinations for Chinese scholars marginalized during Yuan rule. This message resonated powerfully. In the end, the campaign against the Yuan became a war of attrition. City after city, province after province, the Mongols were pushed north. In 1368, when Zhu's forces took Dadu, present-day Beijing, the last Yuan emperor Tohon Timur fled to the Mongolian steppes. For the Mongols, this retreat did not mean the end of the war, but a change of strategy. From their perspective, they were simply returning to the steppes where they had launched their conquests. They would regroup, regain strength, and return to claim what they considered theirs by right. They established their court in Karakoram, the ancient capital of Genghis Khan, and began calling themselves the Northern Yuan dynasty. In their minds, they remained the legitimate rulers of China, temporarily in exile. Togun Timur retained the title of Emperor of China until his death in 1370, being succeeded by his son, Ayur-Shiridara. However, the reality on the ground was much more complex. The once unified Mongol people were now divided into factions. Some tribes recognized the Northern Yuan as their legitimate leaders. Others followed their own local khans, and some even began negotiating independently with the Ming. This political fragmentation was aggravated by severe economic problems. During their rule in China, the Mongols had become dependent on the agricultural and commercial resources of the empire. Now, confined to the steppes, they faced an acute economic crisis. The trade routes that had flourished under the Mongol Pax were now interrupted. Tax revenues had been reduced to a fraction of what they were. And most worryingly, many Mongols had lost the traditional survival skills in the steppe. Generations raised in the palaces of Beijing no longer knew how to live like their nomadic ancestors. The irony was bitter. The fiercest conquerors in history now struggled to readapt to the way of life that had once made them invincible. Meanwhile, in China, Emperor Hongwu implemented policies that would transform the country and prepare it for the final confrontation with the Mongols. His first objective was to consolidate power. Having emerged from the ashes of civil war, Hongwu knew unity was fragile. He systematically eliminated potential rivals, even former allies of the rebellion. He established an internal espionage system so effective that even the most powerful ministers feared speaking freely. And he abolished the position of prime minister, personally assuming direct control of the government. These authoritarian measures were combined with populist reforms. He distributed land to impoverished peasants, reduced taxes for the lower and middle classes, built public granaries to prevent famines, and promoted a return to traditional Confucian values, presenting his government as a restoration of true Chinese civilization after barbarian occupation. But perhaps his most significant reform was military. Hongwu had defeated the Mongols, but he knew they would return. He embarked on a massive defensive strengthening program. The Great Wall, which had fallen into disrepair during the Yuan era, was rebuilt and expanded. A system of watch posts and fire signals was established along the northern border, capable of quickly alerting to Mongol incursions. The Ming army was reorganized into a system of permanent strategically located garrisons. Each soldier received regular training in tactics, both defensive and offensive. But the most innovative was the creation of units specialized in fighting the Mongols on their own terrain. Light cavalry that could pursue the nomads and mobile artillery that could devastate their concentrations. By 1380, the Ming had gone from being a rebel force to becoming one of the most sophisticated armies of their time, and their gaze was firmly set on the north, where the remnants of the Yuan dynasty regrouped for what they hoped would be their great counteroffensive. The situation among the Mongols, meanwhile, had worsened. Upon the death of Ayur-Shiridara in 1378, the imperial title passed to his son Togus Timur. This young Khan faced a monumental task: unifying a fragmented people, revitalizing a crisis-ridden economy, and preparing to recover China. Togus Timur was intelligent and ambitious, but he lacked the political experience of his predecessors. He relied excessively on advisors who often prioritized their own tribal interests over the common good of the Mongols and fatally underestimated the transformation the Ming had undergone under Hongwu. Still, By 1387, Togus Timur had made significant advances through a combination of diplomacy, bribes, and occasional force. He had reasserted Yuan authority over many dissident tribes. He had reorganized his army by incorporating tactics that combined traditional Mongol mobility with elements adopted from Chinese infantry. And he had established alliances with Western Turkic peoples, expanding his power base. He felt ready for the great confrontation. His scouts reported that the Ming garrisons on the northern border were weakened by internal conflicts. Emperor Hongwu himself, now aged, seemed more concerned with palace intrigues than external threats. The opportunity seemed perfect for a decisive attack that would demonstrate the continued relevance of the Yuan and possibly begin the road back to Beijing. What Togus Timur did not know was that he was being manipulated. The apparent weaknesses on the Ming border were an elaborate trap designed specifically to lure the Mongols into an engagement under unfavorable conditions. And the general in charge of executing this plan was one of the most brilliant and ruthless commanders in Chinese history, Lan Yu. Lan Yu had risen from humble origins to become Hongwu's chief military strategist. Unlike many traditional Chinese generals, Lan did not see war as a series of formal maneuvers dictated by ancient manuals. For him, war was a pragmatic science where adaptation, deception, and innovation were more important than traditions. His plan for the Mongols was bold. Instead of maintaining a purely defensive posture, he would deliberately leave certain invasion routes open. He would position seemingly small and vulnerable forces as bait. And when the Mongols advanced deep into Ming territory, he would spring the trap with much larger forces hidden in strategic positions. Can we blame Togus Timur for falling into this trap? Perhaps not. The Mongols had conquered half the world by relying on their ability to defeat larger armies through superior mobility and innovative battle tactics. As the year 1388 began, the pieces on the board moved toward an inevitable confrontation. Togus Timur gathered the largest Mongol army since the time of Kublai Khan, approximately 50,000 warriors. Lan Yu, for his part, advanced north with a force of 80,000 soldiers, most hidden to maintain the illusion of vulnerability. The stage was set for a clash that would decide not only the fate of two dynasties, but the balance of power in East Asia for centuries. And so we return once again to the shores of Lake Bur, where two empires prepare for combat. One fights to reclaim its glorious past, the other to secure its future and avenge a century of humiliation. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be on the eve of a battle that will change the course of history? What thoughts pass through the minds of leaders who know that their decisions in the coming hours will determine the fate of entire nations? Keep watching to witness the culmination of this historical drama, where we will discover how an empire born in the steppes faced its final twilight. Dawn of May 14th, 1388. The sun rises slowly over Lake Bur, illuminating a landscape that will soon become the scene of one of the most decisive battles in Asian history. In the Mongol camp, Togus Timur performs traditional rituals before combat. Shamans burn aromatic herbs and offer mare's milk to the spirits of the ancestors. A white horse is sacrificed, its blood spilled to ensure victory. The Khan himself, dressed in blue and black lacquered armor, addresses his generals in a yurt adorned with silk banners representing the four khanates of the once unified Mongol Empire. "Today we recover what is ours by right," he proclaims in a firm voice despite his youth. Togus Timur is barely 28 years old, but he carries on his shoulders the weight of generations. Our ancestors conquered the world from these same steppes. The Chinese think we are weak because they have pushed us back to our native land, but they forget that this land is the one that forged Genghis Khan. Here we are not exiles, we are wolves that have returned to their lair to regain strength. His words are met with the traditional clashing of swords against shields. The Mongol commanders feel the moment is propitious. Their scouts reports indicate that the Ming army advancing from the south is relatively small, barely 30,000 men led by a general named Lan Yu, a force that in their opinion is no match for the 50,000 experienced warriors they have gathered. What they do not know is that Lan Yu has strategically divided his real army of 80,000 soldiers. The visible force is only the vanguard. The bulk of the Ming troops advance by alternative routes, preparing for an enveloping movement that will close all possibility of retreat. While the Mongols believe they are setting an ambush, They are the ones being drawn into a carefully prepared trap, 10 kilometers to the south. In the Ming camp, the atmosphere is markedly different. There are no shamanic rituals or animal sacrifices. Instead, officers study detailed maps of the terrain and meticulously review each phase of the battle plan. Lan Yu, a 52-year-old man with a severe face marked by scars from previous campaigns, personally inspects each unit. Lan Yu is the prototype of the new type of general that the Ming dynasty has cultivated. Technically competent, disciplined, and completely ruthless, risen from humble origins. He advanced by merit rather than family connections. Every rank he holds he has earned with blood, sweat, and a strategic brilliance that even his enemies respect. The Mongols think they know us. He explains to his commanders during the final strategy meeting, they believe we will fight as we did during the rebellion, defensively, fearful of facing them in open field. This will be their fatal mistake. We are not the same Chinese their fathers and grandfathers conquered. We have studied every one of their tactics. We know their strengths and weaknesses. And today we will use that knowledge to eliminate the Mongol threat once and for all. Lan Yu's plan represents a revolutionary change in Chinese military strategy. Traditionally, Chinese armies preferred defensive tactics, relying on fortifications and numerical superiority. Lan Yu, however, has designed an aggressively offensive strategy. His objective is not simply to defeat the Mongol army on the battlefield, but to annihilate it completely as a fighting force. For this, he has prepared 3 key elements. First, a vanguard force composed mainly of heavy infantry, equipped with crossbows and primitive gunpowder weapons. Their mission is to engage the Mongols frontally and keep their attention fixed in one direction. Second, 2 divisions of heavy cavalry, each of 15,000 riders positioned to attack the Mongol flanks at the precise moment. These riders are equipped with full armor, something the Mongols, accustomed to maximizing mobility, do not use. Third, and perhaps most innovative, a reserve of 10,000 infantry soldiers equipped exclusively with gunpowder weapons, primitive arquebuses, fire lances, and hand bombs. These weapons, although inaccurate and inefficient compared to later developments, have a devastating psychological effect on men and horses unaccustomed to their roar and destructive power. By mid-morning, the 2 armies begin to deploy on the open ground west of Lake Buer. It is a landscape of austere beauty, rolling steppes that in May begin to green, with the lake shining like a blue mirror in the distance. On any other day, it would be a place of tranquil beauty. Today, it will become a hell of blood, gunpowder, and steel. The initial deployment follows predictable patterns. The Mongols adopt their classic crescent formation with the center slightly weak. This tactic, perfected by Genghis, is designed to draw the enemy into the apparently weak center, allowing the wings to then envelop and destroy the attacker. It is a formation that has proven its effectiveness in hundreds of battles. From China to Hungary, the Ming, for their part, form an apparently solid rectangle with infantry in the center and small cavalry units on the flanks. To experienced Mongol eyes, it looks like a traditional Chinese defensive formation, exactly what they expected to face. What they cannot see are the Ming heavy cavalry divisions hidden behind low hills several kilometers away, nor the soldiers with firearms hidden in a depression in the terrain, waiting for the signal to advance. The first move is made by the Mongols. As Lan Yu had anticipated, approximately 10,000 horse archers detach from the main body and begin their characteristic tactic. The whirlwind, galloping at full speed in a huge circle around the Ming formation. They fire a constant rain of arrows, seeking to disorganize the Chinese lines before the main clash. It is a terrifying and beautiful spectacle at the same time. The small, resistant Mongol horses maintain a sustained gallop while their riders, standing in the stirrups, shoot with astonishing precision. Each warrior can loose up to 6 arrows per minute, meaning this initial force is discharging 1,000 arrows every 10 seconds under the Chinese lines. But Lan Yu has prepared a specific response for this tactic. Instead of the traditional static shield formation, he has developed a rotating system. The front ranks of soldiers kneel with large rectangular shields that overlap to form an almost impenetrable wall. Behind them, Crossbowmen fire in coordinated sequences, maintaining constant pressure on the Mongol riders. And most importantly, Lan Yu has ordered strict discipline. No one must break formation to pursue the attackers, which is precisely what the Mongols seek to provoke. After nearly an hour of this exchange, Togus Timur recognizes that the tactic is not achieving the desired effect. Ming casualties are minimal, and his own archers begin to exhaust their arrow reserves. It is time to move to the next phase. With a thunderous sound of drums and horns, the Mongol center begins to advance. It is an impressive force of 20,000 riders led by Togus Timur himself. They advance first at a trot, then at a gallop, and finally at full speed with a collective roar that shakes the earth. The lances gleam under the midday sun, and the silk banners with the blue wolf emblem wave proudly. In the Ming center, Lan Yu observes the advance with studied calm. He waits until the Mongols are less than 400 meters away. The moment when they have fully committed their charge and cannot stop or easily change direction. It is then that he gives the signal. A red banner rises 3 times in the center of the Ming formation. Immediately, the apparently rigid Chinese lines transform. The solid rectangle splits like the doors of a huge palace, creating a corridor in the center, and through this corridor advances Lan Yu's surprise. 5,000 soldiers equipped with gunpowder weapons quickly position themselves in 3 staggered lines. The first line kneels, the second remains slightly inclined, the third stays upright. Each man holds a primitive arquebus or a fire lance. Behind them, 2-man teams prepare small portable cannons mounted on trestles. The order is passed from officer to officer. Fire. What follows is a hell of noise, smoke, and destruction that the Mongols have never experienced. Hundreds of firearms detonate almost simultaneously, creating a wall of lead, fire, and shrapnel that strikes directly against the Mongol charge. The effect is catastrophic. The first line of Mongol riders falls almost completely. The horses, terrified by the roar and the smell of gunpowder, rear up, throw their riders. Who was riding in the second line suddenly finds himself exposed. A stray bullet kills his horse, and the Khan falls heavily to the ground. His personal guards immediately surround him, forming a human shield while trying to provide him with a new mount. It is this critical moment when Lan Yu launches the second phase of his plan. The Ming heavy cavalry divisions, which have remained hidden until now, emerge on the Mongol flanks. They are 30,000 riders in total, each protected by full armor, armed with nearly 4-meter steel lances. The Mongols, already disorganized by the frontal attack, suddenly find themselves attacked from 3 directions. Their wings, which should have enveloped the enemy, are themselves enveloped and separated from the main body on the Mongol right wing. The veteran general Kutuktai tries to reorganize his men to face this new threat. He manages to form a defensive circle with archers in the center and lancers on the perimeter. For nearly an hour, this formation heroically resists repeated Ming charges, but the numbers are against them. For every Mongol, there are almost 2 Ming soldiers, and worse. The Ming have fresh supplies arriving continuously from their rear, while the Mongols are isolated with limited resources. Eventually, Kutuktai's defensive circle breaks. The old general who had ridden with Togus Timur's father and participated in dozens of battles dies with a Ming lance piercing his throat. His last orders are for a small group of riders to try to break through to the Khan and help him escape in the center of the battlefield. Togus Timur's situation is desperate. His personal guard has been reduced from 300 to less than 50 men. 3 horses have been killed under him. An arrow has pierced his left shoulder, and a sword cut has left his face bloodied. Still, the young Khan fights with the courage of his ancestors. With every swing of his sword, he remembers the stories he heard as a child, how his great-grandfather Kublai conquered China, how the great Genghis unified the steppes. He cannot. He must not be the one to end that legacy. But even courage has limits in the face of the crushing reality of a lost battle. When a group of riders sent by Kutuktai manages to reach him, his closest advisors implore him to abandon the field. A living Khan can gather a new army, they say. A dead Khan only serves as a trophy for the Ming. With a broken heart, Togus Timur finally accepts the inevitable. Together with a group of approximately 200 warriors, he manages to break through a weak point in the Ming encirclement and rides north into the depths of Mongolia. Behind him lies a shattered army. Of the 50,000 Mongols who began the battle, more than 30,000 lie dead or dying on the field. Another 10,000 are captured. Only a few thousand in small scattered manage to escape. Ming losses are significantly lower, approximately 8,000 dead and 12,000 wounded. For Lan Yu, it is an acceptable price for what he considers a definitive victory. As the sun sets over Lake Bure, dyeing its waters red, the Ming general tours the battlefield. The bodies of men and horses stretch as far as the eye can see. Once proud Mongol banners lie trampled in the mud. Broken weapons, shattered shields, and dented helmets are mute witnesses to the ferocity of the combat. Lan Yu is not a man given to philosophical reflection. For him, the war is simply a means to achieve political objectives. Yet even he feels the historical weight of the moment. Thus ends an empire. He murmurs to one of his officers, not with a shout, but with a whisper. That night in his tent, he drafts his report to Emperor Hongwu. It is concise and technical, detailing numbers, tactics, and results. Only in the final paragraph does he allow himself a more personal comment. Your Majesty, today we have avenged a century of humiliation. Mongol military power has been broken in a way I consider irreparable. Their best generals are dead. Their bravest warriors have fallen. Their Khan flees north with barely a handful of followers. The Yuan dynasty, which once ruled from the Pacific to Europe, is now nothing more than a memory. China can finally breathe easy. What Lan Yu cannot know is that his victory is even more complete than he imagines. The Mongol Empire, which had begun to fragment even before this battle, will now disintegrate completely. The tribes, without the cohesion provided by strong central leadership, will return to their ancient rivalries. The sophisticated imperial administration that Genghis Khan's descendants had built will collapse in a matter of years. Tugas Timur, the last Khan with true imperial aspirations, will be assassinated by internal rivals just 3 years later. His death will mark the definitive end of any serious attempt to rebuild Genghis Khan's empire. The era of the Mongols as a dominant force in Asia has come to an end. A new order led by the Ming dynasty is about to begin. How is it possible that an empire that came to control the largest contiguous territory in history collapsed so completely? Was the Battle of Lake Bure the cause, or merely the symptom of a deeper decline? I invite you to reflect on these questions as we continue exploring the consequences of this decisive confrontation and the legacy it left in world history. The weeks following the Battle of Lake Bure witnessed a relentless pursuit. Lan Yu, determined to eradicate any possibility of Mongol resurgence, divided his army into smaller units that spread across the steppes like a dragnet. These Ming forces operated with brutal precision. Any Mongol group larger than 100 warriors was attacked immediately. Nomadic settlements that resisted surrender were razed, while women and children were sent south as slaves. Tugas Timur, meanwhile, fled ever farther north, toward territories that today form part of Siberia. With each passing day, his entourage diminished. Some warriors deserted, seeing the causes lost. Others fell to Ming ambushes or simple exhaustion. By the autumn of 1388, the once powerful Khan traveled with barely 50 loyal followers. At this point, the story becomes more blurred, with different sources offering contradictory versions. Ming records claim their forces eventually caught up and killed Tugas Timur near the Kerulin River. Later Mongol chronicles, however, suggest he managed to escape and establish a small khanate in the far north, where he lived several more years before being betrayed by a relative. What is indisputable is that by 1390, centralized Mongol power had completely disappeared. What remained of the once glorious empire of Genghis Khan were now dozens of small tribal confederations, each fighting for its own survival. The Northern Yuan dynasty, which had kept alive the fiction of being the legitimate rulers of China, disintegrated into internal struggles. Different members of the Mongol royal family established rival claims to the title, but none had the resources or support to make them effective. By the year 1400, the title of Great Khan had become practically ceremonial. with no real power attached. In contrast, the Ming dynasty entered a golden age. Emperor Hongwu, validated by this decisive victory, consolidated reforms that would transform China into a global power. His son and successor, the Mongol Emperor, would further expand this influence, sponsoring the famous naval expeditions of Zheng He, which carried the Ming flag as far as East Africa. China had completed an extraordinary historical cycle of being conquered by northern barbarians to once again becoming the preeminent empire of East Asia. But let us return to the Mongols. What had happened to the people who once made the world tremble? The fall was as spectacular as their rise had been meteoric. In barely 2 generations, they went from being rulers of the largest land empire in history to returning to their condition of scattered nomadic tribes, struggling for survival in the harsh steppes. Several factors explain this catastrophic collapse. First, the Mongols never developed a national identity that transcended tribal loyalties. Unlike China, which maintained a sense of cultural and political continuity through the centuries, the Mongols remained fundamentally organized in tribal structures. When central leadership weakened, these tribal divisions resurfaced with force. Second, the economic base of the Mongol Empire was always precarious. Their true strength lay in military mobility, not in the production of goods. They depended on trade and tribute from sedentary peoples to maintain their standard of living. Once they lost access to these resources, they faced a severe economic crisis. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Mongols suffered a profound identity crisis. Generations born during the imperial peak had abandoned many of the traditions and skills that had made their ancestors so formidable. They were not fully sedentary like the Chinese, but neither did they fully maintain the traditional nomadic way of life. This identity crisis manifested particularly acutely among the Mongol elite. Descendants of Genghis Khan had been educated in palaces, surrounded by luxuries, with Chinese and Persian tutors teaching them philosophy, mathematics, and literature. When they were expelled to the steppes, many lacked the basic survival skills that every traditional nomadic child learned. An anonymous Mongol poem from the time captures this loss of identity. Our ancestors rode from the 4 winds. Their bows sang the song of conquest. We, their children, forgot the language of the wind, and our bows hang silent in empty yurts. What are we now? Neither Khans nor nomads. The steppe calls us, but we no longer know how to listen. For the common Mongol people, the transition was less traumatic. Many simply returned to the old ways of life: nomadic herding, hunting, and occasional raids against weaker neighbors. Life in the steppes, hard but familiar, continued as it had for millennia before Genghis Khan. But for the former imperial elite, the fall was devastating. Many fell into depression and alcoholism. Others tried to maintain miniature imperial courts, pale imitations of past glory. Some even adopted Buddhism as a way to escape the pain of the present, retreating to makeshift monasteries. A particularly tragic aspect of this fall was the cultural loss. During their imperial peak, the Mongols had been great patrons of the arts and sciences. Kublai Khan's court had attracted scholars from the entire known world. The imperial postal system YAM had facilitated an unprecedented exchange of ideas across Eurasia with the collapse of the empire. This cultural flourishing ended abruptly. Libraries were destroyed or abandoned. Administrative systems crumbled. Knowledge accumulated over generations was lost in a single generation. The Battle of Lake Byr thus represents much more than a military defeat. It symbolizes the end of a unique historical experiment, the attempt of a nomadic people to create a global empire without completely abandoning their traditional identity. In contemporary terms, we could see it as a clash between 2 models of civilization: the sedentary agricultural model of China, based on stability, hierarchy, and continuity, and the pastoral nomadic model of Mongolia, based on mobility, adaptability, and expansion. For a brief but extraordinary period, the nomads dominated, but in the long run, the sedentary model proved more sustainable. The Battle of Lake Byr marked the definitive turning point in this civilizational confrontation. For the Ming, the victory represented not only a military triumph, but an ideological validation. Their worldview, with China as the Middle Kingdom and nomadic peoples as marginal barbarians, seemed confirmed by events. This Sinocentric vision would dominate Chinese foreign policy for the next 5 centuries. You may wonder, could history have taken a different course? What would have happened if the Mongols had won at Lake Bur? It is a fascinating question for counterfactual history. A Mongol victory would probably have resulted in new incursions into China, possibly even the reconquest of parts of the north. However, it is doubtful they could have fully rebuilt their previous dominion. By 1388, China under the Ming was already a much more cohesive and militarily capable state than the Song state the Mongols had originally conquered. Most likely, a victory at Lake Bur would have given the Mongols a few more decades of relevance as a regional power. But it would hardly have reversed the general trend of imperial decline. And what about Toghus Timur? Did the last Khan really try to restore the glory of the empire? His ultimate fate remains one of the great mysteries of Asian history. Some Mongol oral traditions suggest he eventually found refuge among Western Turkic peoples, where he lived incognito until his natural death. Others claim he was assassinated by Ming agents disguised as merchants. The official Ming records, as we mentioned, insist he was captured and executed. Perhaps the most poetic version, though historically dubious, comes from a 15th century account claiming that Toghus Timur abandoned all imperial pretension and spent his final years as a simple shepherd, tending a small flock in the remote Altai Mountains. According to this story, only on his deathbed did he reveal his true identity to his children, advising them, "Power is like the wind of the steppe. It lifts you high, but eventually it abandons you. Only the land remains constant." Whatever the truth about his personal end, the end of his dynasty is undeniable. With the defeat at Lake Bur, the Yuan dynasty joined the long list of empires that rose meteorically, shone intensely for a time, and then faded into the darkness of history. As the 14th century came to an end, the world was already a very different place from the one Genghis Khan had known. The system of Mongol khanates that once dominated from Korea to Hungary had collapsed into unrecognizable fragments. The trade routes that had flourished under the Mongol Pax were interrupted, and China, after a century as a province of a nomadic empire, had reclaimed its traditional place as the dominant civilization of East Asia. Mist settles gently over the rolling hills surrounding Lake Bur. 637 years have passed since that fateful battle, but the wind still seems to whisper stories of glory and tragedy. Today, this tranquil spot on the border between Mongolia and China is barely visited by a few local herders and occasional historians. Nothing indicates that here the fate of Asia was decided. The Mongol Empire as a political entity vanished centuries ago. Yet its impact on world history continues to resonate in ways that perhaps even Genghis Khan himself could not have imagined. His legacy transcends mere military conquests, permanently transforming the cultural, political, and genetic landscape of Eurasia. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this legacy was the creation of the first truly intercontinental exchange system. Under the Mongol Pax, merchants, missionaries, artists, and scientists could travel with relative safety across vast distances, ideas, technologies, and products that were previously confined to specific regions began to circulate freely. Gunpowder invented in China reached Europe through Mongol routes. Agricultural techniques developed in Persia were introduced to China. Mathematical advances from India and the Islamic world spread east and west. This medieval globalization accelerated technological and scientific development throughout Eurasia, laying the foundations for later transformations. Marco Polo, whose famous descriptions of Asia fascinated Europe, was only able to make his extraordinary journey thanks to the stability the Mongol dominion had created. His accounts, though often exaggerated, opened the European mind to the existence of advanced civilizations beyond its known borders. Ironically, while their empire fragmented, the genetic impact of the Mongols consolidated. Modern genetic studies have shown that approximately 8% of men in the territories that once formed part of the Mongol Empire carry the same Y chromosome haplogroup, possibly derived from Genghis Khan and his direct descendants. It is perhaps the most dramatic example of genetic impact attributable to a single lineage in human history. For China, the Mongol experience left a contradictory legacy. On one hand, the Mongol century was remembered as an era of national humiliation, a collective trauma that reinforced xenophobic and isolationist tendencies in Chinese political culture. The Ming dynasty, born in rebellion against the Yuan, institutionalized policies that limited contact with foreign barbarians and glorified an idealized version of traditional Han culture. On the other hand, China emerged from the Mongol era transformed in many aspects. The centralized administrative system that the Yuan implemented was largely maintained by the Ming. The definitive territorial integration with the incorporation of regions like Yunnan and Tibet into the Chinese sphere was a direct legacy of Mongol unification. And although the Chinese strove to erase barbarian cultural influences, elements such as musical instruments, artistic styles, and Mongol linguistic terms remained intertwined in the Chinese cultural fabric. For the Mongols themselves, the fall from imperial heights had lasting consequences. After the fragmentation of the empire, the Mongol tribes returned to their traditional patterns of internal conflict and shifting alliances. Unable to seriously threaten China again, they became pawns in a larger geopolitical game between China and later Russia. During the Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1912, the Manchus employed sophisticated divide-and-conquer strategies to keep the Mongols fragmented and subordinated. Religion also played a crucial role. Tibetan Buddhism, actively promoted by the Qing, provided the Mongols with a new cultural identity that gradually displaced ancient shamanic traditions in the warrior ethos. By the time Mongolia declared its independence in 1911, following the collapse of the Qing dynasty, little remained of the imperial spirit that had once animated the hordes of Genghis Khan. Modern Mongolia, although proud of its historical heritage, is a nation of barely 3 million people, mostly urbanized, seeking its place in a world dominated by its two huge neighbors, Russia and China. It is a historical irony that the people who once created the largest land empire in history now inhabit one of the world's least densely populated countries, trapped between two powers. So what universal lessons can we draw from this extraordinary saga of rise and fall? First, the history of the Mongols reminds us that military power alone is never enough to sustain an empire. The Mongols conquered with tactical brilliance, but governed with administrative systems borrowed from the civilizations they had subdued. When these systems collapsed, they had no native structures to replace them. Second, the importance of cultural adaptability. The early generations of Mongol leaders showed extraordinary openness to foreign ideas and practices, adopting the best from each conquered civilization, but eventually fell into the common trap of many empires, the dilemma between assimilation and cultural preservation. Trying to maintain their nomadic identity while ruling sedentary populations created contradictions that eventually proved unsustainable. Third, the danger of internal divisions. The Mongol system of dividing territory among heirs, appropriate for a limited-scale nomadic society, proved disastrous when applied to a transcontinental empire. Family and tribal rivalries, momentarily suppressed during the imperial rise, resurfaced with destructive force during the decline. Fourth, all empires eventually faced the limits of their expansion. For the Mongols, the Battle of Lake Byra represents the point where the advantages that had given them supremacy, mobility, warrior ferocity, tactical innovation were finally overcome by the inherent disadvantages of their model: low population density, precarious economic base, and fragile political cohesion. Finally, Mongol history teaches us about the cyclical nature of power. In barely 2 centuries, the Mongols went from being a marginal people on the periphery of civilization to dominating much of the known world, and then returning to marginality. It is a humbling reminder that even the most powerful empires are, on the scale of historical time, relatively brief phenomena. As historian Arnold Toynbee once said, empires are mostly doomed to follow the inexorable cycle of growth, maturity, decline, and death. The Mongols were no exception to this rule. Their singularity lies in the extraordinary speed and drama with which they traverse this cycle. Today, as we contemplate the peaceful waters of Lake Byra, it is hard to imagine the clamor of that battle that marked the twilight of an empire. The cries of warriors, the thunder of hooves, the roar of the first firearms will have faded into the silence of history. But if we listen carefully to the wind blowing over the steppes, Perhaps we can hear the distant echo of a universal lesson, that all glory is fleeting, that all power is temporary, and that even the greatest of empires is ultimately only one more chapter in the endless story of humanity. If this journey through the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire has fascinated you, I invite you to explore other great historical turning points on our channel, from the fall of Rome to the collapse of modern empires. Each story offers us valuable lessons about the nature of power, leadership, and the destiny of civilizations. Subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries and share your reflections in the comments. Which empire in history do you find most fascinating? What lessons from the past do you think are most relevant to our current world? Thank you for joining me on this journey through time to the shores of Lake Brir, where the heirs of Genghis Khan faced the final twilight of their empire.